Hey guys, Tony Rowe here. Doing something a little bit different. I think this is my first opening series since Reddit opening of the week, so I hope you guys like it. I have been in the lab, so to speak, messing around, trying to find something that I like versus the Catalan, now that I'm playing d4, d5 a little bit more. That's one of those things that at my level is pretty common. So for those people who aren't familiar, the Catalan is the main alternative to the standard Queen's Gambit after d4, d5, c4, e6. This is the Queen's Gambit declined, and usually, as you can see in this opening explorer here, white is going knight c3 and then bishop f4, bishop g5, but those guys who really like positional play and they like to fianchetto their bishops and they want that small, tiny edge throughout the game, they'll play g3. And yeah, it's a tough move to face if you haven't looked at it. I've lost many a game to the Catalan, and I've been on the white side, and I know how much pressure white can generate, seemingly out of nowhere with this slightly innocuous g3 move. So the move that I've selected, there are three main moves here: d takes c4, bishop e7, or bishop b4 check. And the move that I selected is bishop b4 check. And it just seems to fit my style. I like it. There's some subtlety and nuance here that I think, if you've studied it, will help you as compared to the other moves. And I'm less interested in going d takes c4 and getting into a really sharp sort of full-bodied struggle right out of the opening. I'd rather kind of play it cool a little bit. And I think that bishop b4 check has some advantages over bishop e7 right away, which we'll talk about shortly. So firstly, why play bishop b4 check? So let's start with that, I guess, and then we'll get to kind of the theory in a bit. So the idea of bishop b4 check after, let's say, the main move, bishop d2, is not to take. That would be ill-advised. The idea is to retreat the bishop to either d6 or e7, and e7 is the main square. But in this series, we're going to be talking specifically about bishop d6, which is a relatively new move. Hopefully, it'll have some surprise value for your opponents if they haven't seen it before. And it contains its own little subtleties and advantages and disadvantages. And of course, I'll try to do my best to explain those as we go along. Okay, so let's take a look at the alternative, bishop e7, right away to understand why we might want to play bishop b4 check and essentially insert bishop d2 for free for white. So after bishop e7, play would normally continue something like bishop g2, castles, very natural, of course. c6, just bolstering the center. And then white usually, now that black might be threatening to go d takes c4 and b5, something like that, white normally goes queen c2. And the queen is just well placed on c2 in the Catalan in general. Usually white wants to go something like knight d2 and e4, and from c2 the queen supports that e4 push as well. And that's exactly what we see in the main line of this 4 bishop e7 Catalan. Some people call 4 bishop e7 the closed Catalan. And another thing we'll see often in this series, and specifically in a lot of the closed Catalan variations, is black needs to go b6 to fix this terrible bishop on c8. And white gets in the e4 break. And black's options are sort of not great here, and I think this specific variation is one reason why the closed Catalan with 4 bishop e7 has kind of fallen out of favor. Either black takes and goes into a position, probably just bishop b7, I guess, goes into a position like this, where it's very hard to achieve these breaks, and black is sort of limited to the third rank. It's extremely uncomfortable, and you can see white scores very well in these positions. In my database, I think like sort of this aggregate score here is around 75% or so, which is really bad. And the other option after e4 is to just allow e5. For instance, bishop b7, e5, knight e8, takes, and then rook e1, planning bishop f1. And again, we see black has some problems here. This knight is really bad. It doesn't have any actual squares. This bishop is not very good. This knight is not very good. And again, black simply has less space because of this e5 pawn. So one thing we see, okay, and then of course there's also bishop d6 immediately, which would be a little bit more analogous to our main line because I'm going bishop b4 check, bishop d2, bishop d6. This will be our recommended variation. So what happens if bishop d6 immediately? And again, bishop g2, castles. Let's say c6, knight c3, knight b to d7. Very normal stuff. And then white has the very strong knight d2. Let's just, what am I doing here? Knight d2. And that protects the c4 square, but far more importantly, threatens to go e4. And this is actually even worse for black than the previous variation because with the bishop on d6, e4 threatens e5 with a fork. And let's say if something like rook e8, e4, d takes e4, knight takes e4, now knight takes e4 gains a tempo on this bishop. And yeah, again, from here, you can see white hasn't even lost a game. Out of 15 or 14 games, white has won almost all of them. So you have to be a little bit leery of allowing e4 in the Catalan like this. And that's the main reason why we insert bishop b4 check first. It might not become totally obvious. It might not be obvious right now, but bishop d2 actually severely impedes white's development. It takes away the d2 square from the knight is the main thing, but also it might be relevant to block the protection of the d4 pawn as well. And this slightly clunky development actually costs white quite a bit later. You can see immediately that this knight fd2 and e4 idea is no longer available, which is the key point. And so usually from here, we'll just continue on. White goes bishop g2, and we go c6. And again, white should probably protect the c4 pawn at some point. After castles, knight b to d7, it would be extremely likely that white would just go queen c2 castles, and we would reach our main line here. This is kind of considered the main tabia of this variation. We'll cover a few alternatives quickly, but yeah, so this is kind of going to be our home in the Catalan, is bishop b4 check, bishop d2, bishop d6, and then we play a bunch of natural moves like so, and we'll cover all of white's options from here. The main moves are rook d1, bishop g5, bishop f4, let's do this, bishop f4, bishop g5, b3, and we'll just cover, for the hell of it, knight c3 as well here. But first, let's go back a little bit and talk about the other blocks. So of course, knight c3 and knight d2 are also possible. They're not as good. The main thing, knight c3 might be the most natural and obvious move. Excuse me. The main problem with going knight c3 is that it becomes surprisingly hard to gain back the c4 pawn if we take it. So after castles, by the way, I think black can just take this immediately, but after castles, bishop g2, this is the normal way people are playing, and then d takes c4. The knight on c3 blocks the sort of normal avenues for capturing the c4 pawn back immediately. Queen a4 doesn't really work because there's a bishop on b4, and the knight on c3 can no longer come to the d2 square, and also blocks the queen from, whoops, I want yellow. I'll get there, yes. Blocks the queen from taking on c4, and of course, knight d2 takes c4 is impossible either. So it becomes a little bit hard for white to regain the c4 pawn in this case. And after castles, knight c6. I think c6 is probably the best square for the knight. Not only does it pressure d4, but it also prepares knight a5 to guard the c4 pawn, which is pretty relevant in a lot of positions. White has found it hard. You can see black scores pretty well here. White has found it hard to generate adequate counterplay for losing the c4 pawn. Just a couple lines. Of course, e4 immediately is not possible because if bishop takes c3, b takes c3, knight takes e4. So white sometimes goes a3, and because black is reluctant to give up this bishop on c3, bishop e7, white can get in e4. And then you can see knight a5 is the main move here, but I sort of started liking this move a6, just preparing b5 and bishop b7. But the real thing I like about it is that if black goes knight a5 right away, it allows in many positions knight e5 from white. And so by going a6, we sort of force white to find other moves besides knight e5 before we eventually go knight a5. And this is Li Chao, Vladimir Katya from Jakarta 2011. And white certainly has some compensation here for the missing pawn. But I think probably black should find a way to unravel here and make his extra pawn count. Probably knight h5 is an idea, just to bonk this bishop away from this good f4 square, and probably black needs to go c5 or f5 at some point. After knight c6, there's also bishop g5, again getting ready for e4, and I think we can just force that. And e4 is actually not much of an issue here. I think black can either go rook b8 and b5, or just rook d8 immediately, and black should be better in either case. And yeah, I think that's really all I want to say about knight c3. The key point is that knight c3 here allows black to take on c4 and just go knight c6 and usual development with bishop b7, and you should have the better position. There's also knight b to d2, and similarly, we're just going to take on c4 immediately. And normal play here is to go bishop g2 and then b5. So black protects the c4 pawn and gets ready to contest the long diagonal and the e4 square with bishop b7. And after castles, white has a couple ways to try and challenge this pawn chain. So the main thing about taking on c4 in all of these positions is that white has sort of obvious ways to try and knock you down on the queen side and blow open, sort of your overextended pawn phalanx here, and so you have to kind of be prepared and ready to deal with that. So if b3, black can just go c3, and I think this is the main reason why black is doing okay in these positions with d takes c4, is that the knight on d2 makes it hard for white to contest this pawn chain with b3, because c3 always gains a tempo, and some people play this way. After knight b1, they try to sort of wrangle up this c3 pawn by a3 or queen c2 or whatever. In this position, black can go bishop b7, and if a3, then there's bishop e4, a key idea here, threatening c2, and black has good counterplay. In fact, this position is extremely dangerous for white. And in this position instead, if a4 first, not a6, since there's a pin along the a file. a6 is sort of just a phantom protector. It doesn't actually work. Black has to go c6. And after c takes, or a takes, c takes, the only real way for white to try and gain play you can see is a knight move along this long diagonal. The main one has been knight h4, and then black is forced to go knight d5. Let's add a box there. I like the box. And then white gets in e4. And, I'm just going to leave it at that. After like knight e7, white has some compensation, but it's probably not enough. It would be my guess. What does Stockfish say? Yeah, it says black is somewhat better here, and that isn't surprising to me. There will be more analysis in this study than I'm going over, so just for time's sake, I'm just going to kind of leave it at that. So those are the main alternatives to bishop d2. On knight c3, we can take castles, knight c6, knight a5, and on knight b to d2, we take and then go b5 and deal with these a3, a4, and b3 strikes as they come along. But white's main move is bishop d2, which practically forces a retreat, so it gains some time, but again, this bishop on d2 bungles up white's development a little bit compared to bishop e7 or bishop d6 white right away, which we saw allows white to get an e4 pretty much immediately. And then bishop g2, c6. We can also go castles or knight b to d7 first. Move order here is not particularly relevant, but c6, queen c2, knight b to d7, castles, castles, and this is our main tabia. It is possible for white to try and go, you know what, we'll get to that later. Is there anything I want to cover here right now? No. Okay, so let's talk about this position for a quick second. I've showed you what the main moves are, but let's talk about this position from like a high-level strategic point of view. So what does each side have? What is each side going to try and do, etc. So the first thing is, for both sides, really, both sides have relatively awkward development. Black has this bishop on c8 that's not very good and has to get out somehow, and white has this problem where this bishop is really on the wrong square and white really wants to go knight b to d2. And so usually white will try and either, and knight c3 we'll find out allows d takes c4 because it stops white's queen from protecting it. And so there's this, white also has this awkward sort of bundle of pieces on the queen side that he has to try and figure out. And so part of the general flow of play is both sides sort of try and unravel and fix their development. The second sort of facet of this play is how both sides will try and arrange their pawn breaks. We've already seen that white really wants to go e4 in this position and either be allowed to go e5 or go into this large space advantage structure with d takes e4 where black is confined to having the e6 and c6 pawns versus the d4, c4 pawns, which would be quite favorable for white and always scores well for white. And black, on the other hand, wants to find some way to break out and liquidate in the center. And traditionally in these sort of, this is almost like a semi-Slav structure, but with g3 and bishop g2. Traditionally in these structures that look like this, black wants to go c5 or e5. And sometimes black will play d takes c4 and then e5 or c5. But the general idea is to try and liquidate your d-pawn and e-pawn or your d-pawn and c-pawn for both of these pawns and just leave the central structure completely symmetrical and, you know, black should be equal. So that's kind of the high-level strategy. Black needs to find some way to get this thing out. Usually it's b6 and bishop b7. Which also helps to go c5 later, b6, c5, or bishop e7, rook c8, etc. And white will try to find some way to develop this knight and go e4. Sometimes it's b3 and knight c3. White protects the c4 pawn first. Sometimes it's moving this bishop to either f4 or g5 and then going knight d2 and then trying to go e4, etc. So that's kind of the usual way that play will continue in these structures. And okay, and by the way, why bishop d6 over bishop e7? Both have benefits and downsides. Bishop d6 is maybe a slightly more active and logical square. You can see that we kind of enforce a semi-Slav structure here. And in the semi-Slav, black is usually going to go bishop d6. It protects the e5 square. It does a slightly better job of preparing e5. And it also allows e7 for the queen, which after bishop e7 is not possible. And I think those are sort of the main upsides. The main downside, of course, is that if for whatever reason white wants to go c5 later, it loses a tempo. That's very uncommon. The main downside, I think, is that after e4, bishop d6 strengthens white's e4. The reason being is that if the bishop were on e7, e4, black can just allow it and still have a move because e5 does not threaten a fork, whereas e4, e5 here threatens to win a piece. And as we saw in the line with bishop d6 immediately, let me go back. Bishop d6 immediately. Now when white gets in e4, for instance, rook e8 takes. If we take, because of the threat of e5, then a knight hitting e4 hits the bishop. And so our bishop is more exposed to sort of tactical operations on this square, but it also has some key benefits. And so, okay, so let's talk about the main line here. Okay, so bishop b4 check, bishop d6, bishop g2, c6, queen c2, knight d7, castles, castles. And white has a lot of moves here. Let's just sort of knock them out in sort of a sensible order. Knight c3, I think, is probably the worst move here. And as I mentioned already, we should take on c4. And white has a couple ways to try and gain compensation, but I'm kind of dubious on them. First, note that this is kind of a triumph of putting the bishop on d6, is that e4 right away, grabbing the center and threatening e5 can be met with e5 from black. And I don't think black has very many problems here in general. There's also rook a to d1, just sort of a normal, natural developing move here. And there was a Georg Meyer game that went bishop e7, or queen e7, bishop g5, h6. Usually bishop g5 is met by h6 in these positions, just grabbing the bishop immediately. One consequence of going g3 in all of these positions is that after h6, white can't really go bishop h4 because the bishop gets trapped. So white relinquishes the dark squared bishop in a lot of these Catalan positions. And that game continued knight d2, and then black got in e5, and shouldn't be worse here. So check out the rest of that game in the analysis if you'd like. The main move is bishop g5 immediately. So after knight takes c3, knight c3, d takes c4, bishop g5 immediately, we can go h6, and if bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, e4, we can just go bishop back to e7. And we're looking to go b5 and just keep the pawn, perhaps with rook b8, etc. And yeah, okay, the main game went a4 to stop this. And then now I think rook b8, which is a novelty, is quite good. Just getting ready to go b5 and being stubborn about keeping the c4 pawn. And one nice thing is that when white goes bishop g5 and takes, trading off one minor piece in these positions is actually incredibly relevant for black, because this knight flows to f6 quite nicely, and now all of a sudden our position feels a little bit less cramped when dealing with these double center pawns. So I think black should be fine here, maybe even better. Yeah, Stockfish thinks black is slightly better. But, you know, white always has practical compensation in these positions. So there's more analysis on this, of course, if you want to see how play should continue. The cute thing about this position after knight c3, d takes c4, which, granted, most of your opponents and my opponents would not be this prepared and know this, but after h6, that knight e4 is possible because the d6 bishop is hanging. And black can go bishop e7 here, which would be the most obvious and natural move and shouldn't be much worse at all, but I think maybe h takes g5 is better. And then after knight takes d6, we just go knight b6. And the usual, and the main thing is that white would really like to go knight takes c4 here, but this allows g4, and then the d4 pawn hangs. For instance, takes, rook fd1, and then after queen c5, I'm not sure white really has enough compensation. So after bishop g5, h6, here, takes, knight b6, white usually takes on c8, and then goes rook fd1, and then after g4, because this pawn is hanging, we don't want to lose it. Knight e7. David Bursey's found a good way to just go e5. And black should be totally fine here. The c6 pawn does a good job of limiting the scope of white's bishop, and black, again, liquidates away white's advantage in the center, and yeah, no problems. So, but the key thing to note is that just after knight takes c3, d takes c4, and white actually has to be pretty careful here to not end up worse. So, you know, precise play with bishop g5 is required to maintain the balance here. And, you know, I doubt most of your opponents or my opponents would know this much. So, okay, so that's the first move here. Which one to go over next? There are two moves that illustrate another good idea for black, and rook d1 and b3 both allow black to enforce a certain kind of structure here. Sorry, if you guys can hear my dog in the background, he's like panting and like chewing on a bone and stuff, so I apologize for that if you can hear it. Hopefully my mic is like limiting out that background noise, but you never know. So if you hear Morty in the background, you know, my apologies. He hates the Catalan too. Okay, so rook d1 and b3 both allow another important idea to keep in mind for black here. So let's go over b3. That's a little less popular. And that idea is to go knight e4. And this is a common idea in the Catalan in general, and in this line, it's also quite common, if allowed. And the main idea addresses two of black's key needs. We talked about black's need to kind of fix his development, and also the need to be able to deal with e4 from white. And by going knight e4, black is pretty much guaranteeing that he's going to trade off a set of minor pieces and also give his knight on d7, which is kind of clunky, a much better square on f6. And the second thing is that moving the knight on f6 allows us to go f5 and enforce a stonewall structure, which will stop e4 forever. And so this is the key idea. After knight c3, we'll take that bishop. Thank you very much. The dark square bishop in the stone wall for white tends to be fairly relevant because black has a lot of dark squared weaknesses. And so by leaving just you with the dark squared bishop, you sort of ensure that your control over the dark squares won't be severely diminished later. And so this tends to be a pretty acceptable stone wall for black, especially because in the Catalan, most stone walls occur with the bishop on e7, but the bishop is much better on d6. So this is one triumph again of this 5 bishop d6 idea, is that all of these stone wall structures tend to be much more acceptable for black when we can go queen e7 and when the bishop is guarding this e5 square and kind of more actively looking at the king side. So a couple of games I included in here, an analysis I just included in here to reinforce some of the ideas. An interesting idea occurred in this Jan Ludwig Hammer game as black. He went rook b8 with the idea of going b5, and his opponent went f3, presumably looking to go e4 in the future, and Hammer went b5, c5, bishop c7. His opponent went b4, and he struck out against this pawn chain, and then went e5. And this is the key idea when white closes down the center. Of course, e5 is not really possible in any normal stonewall position because c takes d5 would just completely destroy black center. But when white sort of seeks play and extra space on the queen side, e5 becomes a key break here. And of course, e4 would gain a ton of space towards generating a kingside attack if you wanted to go that way. Another idea, actually, that my engines really like is going g5 right away. Part of the idea is that in these stonewall positions, white frequently tries to maneuver both of these knights to these squares, such that they both attack e5, and you can try and sink a knight successfully into that square and really make black suffer. And it becomes hard to do that when you can't use the f4 square. So one idea is to go like this. We'll see after rook d1 that this is another theme, and you know, being able to go knight f3 in some cases. Like for instance, now f4 intending knight f3 with a bind could be met by g4, and white doesn't have access to this f3 square anymore. So, and just in general, black's play tends to be on the king side in the stone wall, and so going g5 immediately and claiming that space while remaining flexible with these other pieces is a reasonable idea. So check out the analysis, see what you think. Both moves are playable, but I kind of like this move. It was hard for me to find a way for white to proceed that didn't involve b4 and c5, b5. Like, for instance, a3, a5, stopping b4. And then, I mean, what else? How else does white make progress besides closing the center and getting in b4? You can't go rook a to b1 now because of bishop, because of bishop takes a3. And if you start with rook b1 instead, then queen e7 still stops b4, and again, white still has to play c5. But all of these ideas allow e5, and then I think something like this, black should be totally fine. f4 is coming, and you know, black should have pretty good chances on the king side. So rook f6 both guards c6 and gets ready for rook h6, etc. So I think this g5 move is interesting, and we'll see that that's an option again after rook d1. So rook d1 also, rook d1 is actually the main move. So if you look in the databases after, in this main tabia, rook d1 is the main move. b3 is not particularly popular, but people like to play rook d1. It's just a useful developing move that keeps white's options flexible and also sort of preemptively x-rays the queen on d8 and gets kind of ready to deal with these e5 and c5 breaks. But because it doesn't guard the e4 square, again, black can go knight e4. I was initially attracted to just flexibly going queen e7. The problem is that after bishop g5, h6, takes, knight d2, let's say b6 would be the normal way to play in these positions, just trying to get rid of the, or develop the light squared bishop. There's e4, and you never really want to take here. You always sort of want to leave it and acquiesce to e5. But in this position, the queen on e7, really what you want to do in this position is go bishop e7 and allow e5, knight d7, etc. But you can't do that because the queen is already on e7. And like, this position is just extremely uncomfortable for black, I think. Like knight e5, hitting c6 again, rook a to c8, and then white actually has this crushing move, c5. The point being that taking twice like this allows rook d7, and you lose a piece. So this would be extremely uncomfortable. And so after rook d1, I think just going knight e4 is the best. It's also just the most thematic. And again, just like after b3, we'll just go knight c3, we'll take that bishop, knight takes d2, and then f5. And play is extremely similar to what we've already seen. And after e3, again, I would recommend just going g5. And just to give you kind of an idea of why we might want to go g5, because g5 is not my first choice in this position. Like, this, g5 would not be my first candidate move in this position, but it was insightful to see, like I'd play knight f6 in a blitz game in like 2 seconds. But there was this game, Denishev-Matlockov, from 2014, where white pretty badly outplayed black in these positions. So another idea in this stonewall structure is to go bishop d7, bishop e8, bishop h5. But black is a little bit slow after this knight e2 to f4 idea, because bishop e8 would hang and exchange in a pawn. And already we can see, God, I wish I would have played g5 already. And now this isn't possible. And now we can't really stop white's knights from coming to d3 and f3. And the game continued queen e7, knight f3, knight e4, knight d3, bishop e8. And one move before black can play bishop h5 takes f3. White goes knight e5. And now black went g5, but it was really too late. And tons of moves are good here for white, but one interesting one is just b4 immediately. And yeah, the problem here with any of these stone walls where you have a knight on e4 and white has already gotten these guys going is that at some point you can get rid of one knight. You could play bishop takes e5 and knight takes e5, but there's no way to get rid of the second knight, really. This knight is too far away, and usually white can play bishop takes e4 at some point and just leave you with this knight versus this terrible bishop. And so this position is not to be repeated. But if you go g5, there's no good way for white to get both of his knights sort of on these critical squares. Again, if f4, we're going to go g4, and knight f3 to e5 is no longer possible. And it's actually hard to even get a single knight to the e5 square in this position. So, and again, after this, the only plan I really saw for white was to expand on the queen side. And if a3, I like going a5 because this, again, practically forces white to go c5. And once white goes c5, it's easy to just go e5 and gain very good play in the center and the king side. So that would be the main plan here, is kind of force white to go c5, like let's say a3, a5, rook a to b1, queen e7. Again, shout out to bishop d6 for allowing queen e7. And then if white wants to ever go b4, b5, he has to go c5, and we get to go e5. And I think black has good counterplay in this position. Okay, so that covers b3, rook d1. We've covered knight to c3. We know we're taking on c4 there. The last two are the bishop moves. So again, white wants to go move this dark squared bishop somewhere so he can go knight d2 and get on with preparing this e4 break. So if bishop f4, which is an interesting idea, white is essentially saying, you know, I want to trade off these dark squared bishops because that's your good bishop. My bishop on d2 is not very good, and I'm willing to accept this kind of janky pawn structure to do so. But I don't think black should have very many problems in these positions, luckily. And again, we need to do something about this bishop, and so we should go b6 and just get on with our development. Either bishop b7 is the most common, but bishop a6 is possible. And there are two main moves for white here, I believe. Knight e5 and c takes d5. And one critical idea to remember here, I think, is that after c takes d5, it looks like, okay, maybe we can't go knight takes d5 because the c6 pawn is hanging and he'd be hitting a8. But and by the way, c takes d5 is playable. So if you just want to play c takes d5, I've quoted this game. I don't think black is much worse in these positions at all because of the idea of going knight e4 and kind of unclogging up your development. So if you want to play c takes d5 in this position, you can. But after b6, c takes d5, you can play knight takes d5 because queen takes c6, bishop a6 gives black a ton of play. f4 is hanging, e2 is hanging, rook c8's coming, and of course he can't go e3 and keep it all together because of bishop takes f1. So after knight takes d5, white's best move is probably just e3, protecting the f4 pawn and also preempting bishop a6, and then black has time to just protect the pawn and go bishop b7. And in these positions, black should just be looking for c5. So rook c8, c5, or c5 immediately, etc., and just try and open up the bishop on b7 and liquidate some of white's space advantage in the center. And I don't think black has very many problems here at all. I've quoted this game. You can check out the analysis. But in general, black is just going c5 and should be equal. So check out the analysis if you want more on that move. After bishop f4 takes b6, white's main move is knight e5, hitting c6, and we just go bishop b7. And now that c4 is protected, white can go knight c3. And we just continue on making useful developing moves, preparing c5 at some point. And the one thing that I think is interesting about this position that I wouldn't have grasped at first is that it seems like to solve black's problems, you essentially want to take the knight on e5, which seems weird to me because, of course, usually in chess you leave this tension. Like, I would think that taking on e5 and allowing f takes e5 or even d takes e5 would be a benefit to white's pawn structure. But the key idea here is that after knight takes e5, let's say d takes e5, it's hard for white to deal with the f6 break. For instance, e3, f6. And if white takes and, allows either knight takes or queen takes f6, white still has a pretty bad pawn structure, and black has sort of solved a lot of his development problems by trading off a set of minor pieces. And also, white's knight on e5 is really a great minor piece, and this knight on d7 is not particularly great. So lopping it off makes a lot of sense. And so after this rook fd1, I've given 2 lines, but both involve just taking on e5 at some point. In this one, I just wanted to illustrate that black can go knight g4 and possibly reroute the knight to the f5 square, which in these positions is quite nice because there's no real great way for white to get rid of it. And in this particular structure, the h4 square is also pretty weak. So something like this is possible. But that's the main thing about bishop f4. It's actually quite easy to play against it if you've looked at it at all. So after bishop f4, we just simply take, go b6, and on c takes d5, we take with the knight, and look towards c5, and on knight e5, we just go bishop b7, and then at some point, we just take on e5. You can take on e5 immediately, or you can go, try and make some other developing moves first and then take on e5. But it's always take on e5 and essentially go f6. Okay. And the last move is bishop g5. So white is pushing pretty hard for e4 at this point, wanting to fix the bishop to a square that has influence over the e4 square, and also go knight b to d2 and e4. And as we've seen before, black's correct decision is pretty much always to go h6, grab that bishop, fix your development a little bit. And after knight b to d2, we really can't stop e4 at this point. We just have to allow it and sort of brace for impact. And I think just going b6, e4, and then going bishop e7 is the best option. And white doesn't actually really have much here. Again, we don't want to take and go into this sort of crap structure here. I don't find these positions to be particularly good for black, and I think, again, in this position, white would be threatening c5, which would be fairly crushing. So, yeah, it's almost never correct, in my opinion, to take on e4 in the Catalan unless you have some really concrete follow-up that allows you to sort of change the character of the game again. You don't want to sit in these structures for very long because it's hard to improve your position and it's easy for white to improve his. So after e4, we go bishop e7, and after e5, knight d7. White typically tries to capitalize on the open c file immediately. So after c takes d5, we must take with the c pawn because c6 is hanging, and then white goes rook f to c1. The key point being that rook f to c1 allows both bishop f1 and possibly after a4, a5, or whatever, white can utilize this rook on a1 anyway. And in this position, there are quite a few moves, but I think the most insightful and strongest move is to go knight to b8, which looks totally ridiculous. I mean, I realize that. This is kind of an absurd idea. But first of all, in a position that's completely closed, you can afford to do such ponderous and sort of silly things. But the second thing is that this knight on d7 is just really not good. It has 0 options, and it's kind of cluttering up black's position. We really want to go bishop d7 or whatever, and we just this knight is just not well placed, and it's hindering our development. On b8, however, all of a sudden bishop d7 and knight c6 and then bringing a rook to the c file starts to look like a logical scheme of development. And again, after bishop f1, bishop d7, white has struggled to find good ways to make progress. And after a3, I'd recommend a5. You can go knight c6, but this allows b4 when white has sort of a space advantage everywhere. Whereas if you go a5, I think actually black has pretty good chances for grabbing up all the space on the queen side. For instance, b5, queen b6, knight c6, rook f to c8, or a4, b5, knight c6, etc. I think a5, actually I'm going to go ahead and give that an exclam. I think a5 as a novelty is quite strong. So I think that's honestly all you really need to know about this position is to go after rook f to c1, go knight to b8, and you want to continue with bishop d7, knight c6, bring a rook to the c file, and meet a3 with a5. And I would say in general, look to grab more space on the queen side in the future. But that's pretty much it, and that's how, in general, I would recommend you guys solve your problems in the Catalan. It's a line that I like. I think it's easy to play. I think the ideas are easy to understand. And just a quick review, so just entering the Catalan, we go bishop b4 check, and bungle up white's development with bishop d2, and then we go back to the d6 square, which, remember, ups and downs. It allows queen e7, it's a more active square, but also e4 is a little bit tougher to meet. And after bishop g2, there are castles, etc. This main tabia, there are a lot of options, but any move that allows knight e4, you should probably go knight e4. So on b3 and rook d1, you just go knight e4, you take this knight e4, you take this bishop, and then you go f5, and remember the g5 idea. On bishop f4, we just take it, and then go b6, fixing this light squared bishop and getting ready for c5. And on knight c3, we just lop this thing off on c4 and try and hold it. And on bishop g5, just remember that there's sort of this long forced line. e4, bishop e7, e5 here, takes, rook fc1, and then we go knight b8 and fix our development with bishop d7 and knight c6. Yeah, and lastly, remember, the alternatives, knight d2 and knight c3 allow us to take on c4 and just get a generally good position for relatively little risk. Really, the onus is on white there to prove that the pawn sack is good. So, okay, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if I missed anything, or if you have any questions, with regards to the theory or with regards to like the positional understanding or whatever. Be sure to check out this study. There are some other things that I added in here that I just didn't cover. But for the most part, I think we got it all. So, one thing that's worth talking about is white sometimes, instead of queen c2, will just try and protect this b3 pawn, c4 pawn with b3 like so, and save the move on queen c2 and get ready for knight c3. And in this position, I think we should go e4, knight e4, and in that's all I wanted to say. And after knight c3, we should just continue again in the same vein as before with f5. And this was Anderson Grandelius European Championships 2015. If it's good enough for Grandelius, it's good enough for me, and it's thematic with our repertoire. So we're gonna castles and continue with the typical Stonewall play. So Okay, yeah. So hit me up on YouTube if you have any questions. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know if these types of opening theory videos from, the lab of Tony Rowe are what you like and what you like to see. If you have any requests on opening lines you'd like to see, let me know. Thanks, guys. Bye.